But all that's to say is, you are in Nicaragua, and we want to talk to you about some other stuff too. But of course, we want to really focus on Nicaragua first because there's these upcoming elections that are about to take place. There seems to be already an attempt to lay the groundwork by like the US and the OAS to declare the elections fraudulent even before they happen, which is pretty much what they do to any leftist government across the region. But also there's this sanctions package that the US Congress, I'm not sure if they already passed it or they're preparing to pass it, the Renacer Act, which could be devastating for Nicaragua's economy. So I guess, can you just kind of like give us a brief overview? We hear a lot about Venezuela. We kind of know what's going on in Venezuela. We hear a lot about Cuba and what the US is doing in Cuba, but Nicaragua doesn't get talked about so much. So what's going on in Nicaragua right now in terms of the sort of US propaganda machine going into full gear against Nicaragua, claiming that Daniel Ortega is like rounding people up so that he can, win these fraudulent elections? And what is going to happen in Nicaragua if this sanctions package goes through?
Great question. And there's a few things in there that I want to unpack. I'll begin broadly for people who don't know anything about Nicaragua. Just in a brief nutshell, I've done other videos talking about the history of Nicaragua, and the U.S. meddling in Nicaragua goes back 200 years. The U.S. has invaded Nicaragua multiple times. The U.S. had 3 different military occupations of Nicaragua. The U.S. installed a puppet dictatorship of the right-wing dynasty, the Somoza family, and they had 3 different members of the Somoza family who governed the country with an iron fist, like a kind of monarchy. And then in 1979, after nearly 20 years of struggle, the Socialist Sandinista Front, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, they succeeded after years of armed struggle in overthrowing the U.S. puppet dictatorship in July 1979, and they launched the Sandinista Revolution. The Sandinista Front has always been an interesting hybrid politically. It is socialist, openly socialist, and very left-wing economically. It's geared around supporting poor people and the working class and labor unions and peasants. It's also very strongly Christian in orientation. It's actually the only real example of a liberation theology movement, as it's called, taking state power in Latin America. And it also very much is based in the peasantry, and in the countryside, which is something unique about Nicaragua compared to, say, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela or other revolutionary processes in Latin America. And the Sandinistas took power in a revolution in 1979, and they governed in the 1980s. And then, of course, people, if you know about Nicaragua, you probably know that in the 1980s, the US government waged a terrorist war. The CIA trained the so-called Contras, which, for people who don't know, Contra in Spanish is contrarrevolucionario, which means counter-revolutionary. That was the literal name, counter-revolutionary. And the CIA trained these death squads who terrorized people, massacred civilians, burnt down schools and hospitals to try to wage a terror war to destabilize the country. The US imposed a blockade, which caused major economic problems, inflation, a shortage of goods. And then there was an election in 1985, and President Ortega won the election, and the Sandinista Front was in power. And then in 1990, with all of the violence after nearly a decade of war and the blockade and economic difficulties, the population was really tired. And in 1990, the US government helped create a candidate. They trained her, they funded her campaign. Her name is Violeta Chamorro. She's from the richest oligarch family in the country. The Chamorro clan has had 7 presidents in the history of Nicaragua since the country was formed in the early 1800s. And the US, through the National Endowment for Democracy and one of the first operations from the newly created NED in the 1980s, they helped create her campaign. They funded everything, and she won the election in essentially what was stolen, an election stolen from the US. And that brought in the neoliberal era. It was the first time in modern history that a revolutionary government, a government that came in through revolution, willingly ceded power, gave up power through a democratic election, in 1990. The Sandinistas went into the opposition and they began organizing again. And the Sandinistas had the power to wage a new armed struggle, but they decided to reform, to regroup, to organize among working class barrios in Nicaragua, and to go through the democratic electoral process. And by 2007, from 1990 until 2007, for 17 years, there was the neoliberal era. Poverty skyrocketed, unemployment skyrocketed, prostitution was a huge problem, drug dealing was a huge problem with narcos, drug cartels and all of that, violence, and the country was a mess. And in 2007, which is, in the middle of this, this movement of leftist governments across Latin America, the so-called pink tide, the Sandinistas, they came back to power through democratic elections in 2007, and they have since stayed in power, winning elections consistently. And polls show that they consistently have support of around 60 to 64% of the population. So roughly 2/3, and 3/5 to 2/3 of the population. And the neoliberal opposition forces are entirely bankrolled by the US. And the thing is, the reason that Nicaragua isn't that well known about, including by people on the left, is that when the Sandinistas came back in 2007, they kind of rebranded a little bit. Ironically, they kind of rebranded as Democratic Socialist, which you would think that like the the wave of so-called Democratic Socialists in the US would be excited about that there's an actually existing Democratic Socialist government. Another reason that they didn't get a lot of attention is because they intentionally kind of laid low. The strategy was that we don't want to encourage more problems with US imperialism, so we're not going to stick our head out too high. We are going to renationalize the power grid and the water system and the commanding heights of the economy that were privatized by the neoliberals. And they did that. And they also engaged in massive land reform, which is extremely important in a country like Nicaragua, where over half of the population still lives in the countryside. So they helped redistribute land to poor farmers and peasants and humble people, and have given tens of thousands of land, actually I think hundreds of thousands of land deeds to people to make sure that companies or big landlords can't kick them off their land. So they have engaged in these important processes. As soon as Ortega came back in 2007, one of his first promises, which he immediately fulfilled, was that he was going to create free universal healthcare and free universal education, which he almost immediately did a few months after coming back into power. And still today, Nicaragua, although it's the second poorest country in terms of GDP in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, it has one of the best healthcare systems in Latin America. And the education system is totally free, including higher education. So the Sandinistas have made a lot of strides, but it's true that they held their heads kind of low and were trying not to bring more attention to themselves, trying not to stir trouble. And that was until 2018. In 2018, the elite business interests led by the Chamber of Commerce, the COSEP in Nicaragua, they were tired of Ortega, who was in his third term, and he had been winning the elections and he was very popular, and they couldn't defeat him at the ballot box, so they attempted a coup, a very violent coup attempt, of course, with the backing of the US. And we can talk about some of the people behind the coup, but most of the leaders of the coup in their NGOs and their organizations are funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy, through the US Agency for International Development. These are CIA cutouts that in the 1980s were used to fund and send weapons to the Contras and the opposition then in the 1980s. So there was a very violent coup attempt in 2018. And that was the moment when Nicaragua once again entered the limelight. It was in the corporate media constantly. There was all this propaganda saying that the government is supposedly a dictatorship. And the coup failed. We can talk more about the coup. It was very violent. Sandinistas were literally hunted down. I know friends whose family members and loved ones were killed or tortured or wounded in a very violent coup attempt. And it was very similar to the coup attempts we've seen, especially the coup attempts in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017, with these blockades that they constructed. So there's these tactics we've seen. We saw similar tactics in Hong Kong, these very violent tactics of insurgency to try to basically cause a low-intensity civil war, to create a civil war, to invite international intervention, to overthrow the government. That was what they tried to do, and it failed. And of course, because it failed, Nicaragua was punished. And in late 2018, the US Congress passed the NICA Act, which is a hilarious, I always point this out. It's so funny. It shows how dumb US Congress people are, because I forget what the exact acronym is, but it's NICA Act, NICA Act, but the A in the NICA Act stands for act. So it actually is NIC Act Act. There's act in the name twice, but it shows how smart the Cuban lobby is in Miami, which is what drafted the legislation. And it was Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who has now been replaced by this even more right-wing fanatic. And also it was co-drafted by Albiocires, the Democrat in New Jersey. So this is bipartisan legislation, totally bipartisan. And it was passed in Congress in late 2018 with zero opposition. Now, to be fair, it was passed on a voice vote. You know how they sneakily push those through, but there was zero opposition to the legislation, including from, you know, the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And then that basically created a financial blockade. It's not a full-on economic embargo like we see on Cuba and Venezuela. So Nicaragua still has been able to do trade, but there's a financial blockade. The Nicaraguan government and state institutions have been blocked from accessing loans and the international financial system. Although, to be fair, there was an exception made for COVID, but that was a very exceptional case. But there still is a kind of financial blockade on Nicaragua. And you mentioned that now it's very likely that this November 7th, when there's another election, all the polls show the Sandinista Front is going to win around 2/3 of the vote. And the opposition is going to be crushed because they're very unpopular and very corrupt. And in response to that, it's very likely that the US Congress is going to push through this legislation called the Renacer Act. Renacer in Spanish means rebirth. And the Renacer Act, it doesn't have the name act in it. It doesn't have the word act in the name twice. And it's going to result in even more sanctions. And basically, it's probably going to create a kind of de facto blockade, like the blockade of Cuba and Venezuela. So what it's going to result in is essentially the Trump administration and National Security Advisor John Bolton had declared a so-called troika of tyranny in Latin America. They singled out Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the three countries with self-identified socialist governments that had revolutionary processes. And by the end of this year, it's very likely that all three of those countries are going to be under U.S. blockades.